Episode 2 of 19. You were never broken, just performing brokenness. How trauma became a costume and healing became a stage play. Some of us aren't healing anymore. We're just addicted to the script of being still healing. This episode, a mirror for the identity you may not want to outgrow, but desperately need to. This one's going to mess with your story, especially if you've built a whole identity around healing. We're not here to dismiss your pain. We're here to question the parts of you that never want to stop talking about your pain. You say you're healing, but really you're rehearsing. You post about your trauma like a script. You show vulnerability, but only when it gets engagement. And deep down, you're afraid that if the wounds do heal, you'll lose your voice. You were never broken. You were in pain. You needed safety, but you turned it into a brand. You don't know who you are without the narrative of being someone who's still healing. This isn't an attack. It's an invitation to finally stop performing your pain. Because healing isn't what you talk about. It's about what you no longer need to talk about. You can keep calling it healing, or you can actually let it end. One gives you applause, the other gives you your life back. Section 1. What broken really means and why it's a myth. Broken is a word we reach for when we don't know how else to describe collapse. But collapse isn't the same as defect. You weren't broken, you were disoriented, you were overwhelmed, you were unsafe in a world that didn't make room for your nervous system to breathe. Calling it brokenness was never the truth. It was shorthand, a metaphor. But somewhere along the way, the metaphor got promoted to identity. And now, it's tattooed on your sense of self. You stopped becoming someone with pain and started being someone because of pain. Here's the thing. Real trauma doesn't make you defective. It makes you adaptive. Even the parts you hate, the shutdowns, the panic, the numbness, we're all intelligence, not failure. But we don't teach people that. We teach them to see themselves like cracked pottery, like the damage defines them more than the design. So now you're walking around calling yourself broken, when what you really mean is, I've been impacted. I carry pain that no one saw. I lost track of who I was while trying to survive. None of that makes you less. It makes you real. It makes you someone who's been through the fire and is still here. You're not a defective product. You're a person who's been through something unkind and had to build scaffolding where no one handed you a blueprint. So let's stop calling that broken. Let's start calling it what it actually is, human. Section 3. How pain becomes a brand. You probably didn't mean to start performing it. Pain, I mean. But pain gets applause now. Vulnerability goes viral. Trauma has an aesthetic. And somewhere in between the first time you shared your story and the 10th time you posted your healing journey, something shifted. Your identity started to orbit around the wound. You used to just have pain. Now you are the person who's been hurt. And it's working for you. Because let's be honest, you know exactly how to write about your trauma to get engagement. You've got the cadence, the hashtags, the sad-eyed selfie with the distant caption. You've learned how to open up just enough to look brave, but not so much that it actually costs you anything. Because now, healing is a performance. Trauma is your TED Talk. Woundedness is your aesthetic. And still healing is a stage you never actually planned to step down from. Because stepping down means risking silence. And silence feels like erasure when your pain is the only thing people ever clapped for. So let's name what's actually happening here. You're not just healing, you're also protecting your status. In a world where people don't listen unless you're bleeding, you've kept the wound open just enough to be seen. That's not shameful, it's strategic. But now it's time to ask, do you want applause? Or do you want actual real peace? Because you won't get both. Section 3. The payoffs of staying broken. Let's get even more honest. Sometimes the wound is familiar. Sometimes staying broken works. Not spiritually, not long-term, but psychologically, oh, it pays. You get protection from responsibility. As long as you're still healing, no one expects you to show up fully. You get to stay in the lobby of your life. Not quite in, not quite out, just processing. Which means you don't have to risk failure. You don't have to risk your actual power because you're still recovering. You also get an excuse to avoid intimacy. Nobody really has to know you if you're always a little too tender. They'll be gentle with you or leave you alone. Either way, you stay in control. You also get endless permission to underfunction. No one questions it when you're still working through things. Not your missed deadlines, not your lack of ambition, not your emotional unavailability. See, it's all part of the healing. And best of all, you get a community. People who nod along. People who are also still healing, but never really changing. People who love that you're working on yourself. As long as you never outgrow the group, mind you. And here's the trickiest part. They're not bad people. They're not faking it. But the moment you stop performing pain, the moment you step off that stage, some of them will turn on you. Because your healing threatens theirs, you see. Your peace calls out their performance. So they'll say you're avoiding the work. They'll say that you've gone cold. They'll say that you've lost your empathy. When what you really lost was the addiction to your pain's identity perks. Section 4. How to spot performed brokenness in yourself. This might sting a little, because we're not talking about the raw pain that knocked you sideways. We're talking about the polished version, the curated sorrow, the grief you've turned into a narrative loop. Not because you're still shattered, but because you're still scared. This is how you know. You can articulate your trauma, but not your truth. You've got the story of what happened down to a science. You know the quotes, the patterns, the psychology. You can name the dysfunction in others with chilling accuracy. But when someone asks what you want, not what hurts you, not what you've survived, but what lights you up, what's sacred to you, what you believe in beyond pain, you go quiet. You center every story around what hurt you. Even the stories that start light end up circling the wound. Even joy gets edited down to, this matters because of how much I used to hurt. Everything becomes a prequel to your pain. You talk about healing more than you do anything else. It's not a phase, it's your brand now. It's how you introduce yourself. It's how you connect. If you weren't healing, you're not even sure who you'd even be. Silence feels like identity death. You can't not post. You can't not explain. You need people to know you're still in it, still working, still doing the work. Because without the broadcast, you feel invisible. Without the script, you don't know how to be witnessed. Here's the thing no one tells you. Real healing doesn't need an audience. You don't have to be a character in your own tragedy just to feel real. You don't have to keep the pain on display just to prove you've earned your peace. You don't need to be still healing if you're finally ready to just be. Section 5. What real healing feels like. Real healing isn't loud. It's not a content strategy. It's not a 3-minute reel with piano music. It's not your next vulnerable post. It's quiet. It's internal. It's what happens when the performance finally gets exhausting, and you can let yourself rest from the need to be understood. Here's how you know when it's real. You stop talking about the wound, not because you're hiding, not because it wasn't real, but because it's no longer the centerpiece. It's not the lens anymore. It's just part of your background texture. The wound stops being a headline and becomes a footnote. You don't need people to know what you've been through. You no longer chase validation through disclosure. You're not baiting empathy. You're not measuring connection by how much of your pain someone can hold. Because now, you can hold it yourself. You stop introducing yourself through pain. You don't lead with, "What happened to me?" You lead with who you are becoming. And you're okay if someone doesn't understand your depth immediately. It takes years to understand someone's depth. You're not on a mission to make your trauma make sense to everyone. You don't owe anyone your brokenness to earn their care. You're not healed, you're just no longer rehearsing. That's the real difference. You're not perfect, not untouched, not above the mess. You've just stopped performing the pain in order to feel like you still exist. You're not building identity around your wounds anymore. You're building your life. And you're letting the silence speak for itself. Section 6. The cost of letting go of your wounded identity. No one talks about the grief that comes after the healing, when the story ends and there's quiet. Not peace yet, just silence, just absence, just a timeline with no new posts. Because here's the truth. You lose community, maybe even quote-unquote friends. The people who clapped for your pain might not clap for your peace. Some of them were never there for your wholeness. They were there for the drama, the relatability, the shared ache. Once you stopped bleeding out loud, you stopped being interesting to them. Some of them will say you think you're better than them now, or that you're being fake, because they can't imagine being okay without pretending. You lose the applause. No one throws you a party when you quietly reclaim your selfhood. There's no standing ovation for no longer identifying with your trauma. You just stop posting about it, stop explaining, stop needing people to clap for your survival story. And in a world addicted to spectacle, that feels like disappearing. You lose your emotional safety script, the one where you always had a reason to avoid risk, to avoid intimacy, to avoid accountability. Without it, you're raw again, but this time you're raw without an excuse. You can't blame the wound anymore. Now it's just you, unmasked, responsible, terrifying. But you'll gain your wholeness. You get to wake up and not brace for impact. You get to enter a room and not calculate how much of your pain you need to reveal to be liked. You get to move through the world without narrating your survival. You get to just be. Not broken, not still healing, just you. And that might be the bravest thing you've ever done. Section 7. Let your story go. The story served its purpose. It gave your pain a place to land. It gave your fear a name. It gave your shame a script that other people could understand. It built a bridge from survival to self-awareness. And that matters. But bridges are not homes. You were never meant to live in that story. You were meant to cross it. So if you're still rehearsing your pain just to feel seen, if you're still writing chapters just to keep the spotlight, ask yourself this. What would happen if you just stopped? Not because you're over it, but because you're finally ready to stop needing the performance to prove that you're real. Real healing doesn't need punctuation. It doesn't demand closure posts or public updates. It ends quietly, in the background, like a wound that doesn't itch anymore, like a voice in your head that finally shuts up. You're allowed to move on, even if no one claps, even if the audience leaves, even if the old parts of you feel betrayed by your piece. Because healing isn't what you say, it's what you no longer need to say. So let your story go. Not because it didn't matter, but because it already did.